The topic which I have suggested is the ascent of neo-fascism. Now, following the rise of Hindutva, a number of people have been analyzing why this phenomenon has happened. A number of explanations have been suggested for it. For instance, the fact that there was a very successful Ram Janmabhoomi movement, the fact that the RSS has been trying to spread its wings very widely, establishing schools, getting hold of very young people in order to inculcate its ideology into them, the fact that the secular values which informed our anti-colonial struggle have tended to wane over time. All these various explanations have been offered for the rise of Hindutva. Now these of course are very important explanations, then they contain important insights, but to my mind they are incomplete for at least two reasons. Firstly, of course, there is absolutely no political economy in these explanations. And when we live in times like these days with capitalism, nothing happens without a political economy dimension. The second thing is, the second incompleteness arises because of the fact that the Hindutva rise is really a part of a rise of very similar movements all over the world. You have Milei in Argentina, you have Meloni in Italy, you have Marine Le Pen in France, you have Orban in Hungary, you have Erdogan in Turkey. Netanyahu, of course, is in a category of his own, but he is also a part of the same. He can be described as belonging to this group, but of course a particularly vicious member. You have Modi in India, and so on. You have Trump in the United States. So you have got a phenomenon of a rise of what I would call neo-fascism, and I'll explain later why I use the term neo. The rise of neo-fascism, or a tendency towards the rise of neo-fascism all over the world. They are in power in a number of countries, and where they are not in power, many of these movements are powerful enough to be knocking on the doors of power in their countries, like Marine Le Pen and so on. So the question is that we are really witnessing a phenomenon in the rise of Hindutva which is not India specific. It is really a phenomenon which certainly, I mean, of course, the fact that Hindutva is an India specific thing, but its rise is occurring in a conjuncture that really affects not just India, but it affects a number of countries. There's some kind of a global conjuncture which is conducive to the rise of movements of this kind. Now, what exactly are the common features of all these various movements, and what is it in common between these movements and the 1930s fascist movements, because of which one is at all using the term neo-fascism? I would say that among these, and of course I don't for a moment claim that all these features I'm going to describe characterize all these movements in an equal degree. Of course, some of them are more prominent, some of them are less prominent in some movements, and so on and so forth. But broadly speaking, there are about at least 6 different features which are common to all these movements in varying degrees. One, of course, is the othering of a small minority. That is a central feature of any fascism. It could be a religious minority, it could be an ethnic minority, it could be immigrants, or in different countries, the minority that is othered is of course different. But a very common feature of all fascism is of course the othering of a hapless minority, generating hatred against this minority within the majority community. The second feature is of course a very close relationship between all these elements and monopoly capital. This is something which is missed. For instance, whenever a very common way in which these movements are described in many circles is to call them populist. A distinction is often drawn between left populism and right populism. As a matter of fact, calling them populist misses the very close relationship that exists between monopoly capital on the one hand and these groups on the other. This is an extremely important common feature of all these movements. The third thing is, of course, they're all very repressive. They're anti-democratic. They put artists, they put intellectuals, trade unionists, leftists, communists, socialists, and so on, liberals in jail for protesting against their rule. In other words, of course, they are repressive, but the distinction between repression let loose by an authoritarian regime and repression let loose by a fascist regime must never be lost sight of. One of the differences is, of course, the fact that, as I mentioned, one of the differences is that the fascist regime necessarily targets a minority. But the other difference is, according to me, the fourth feature, and that is that quite apart from the repression let loose by the organs of the state, the fascist movements have their own youth, their own thugs, which are really let loose upon people who don't agree with them. For instance, Mussolini had the Balailas, which were in fact the fascist youth groups, and so on. So that, this is a very common feature of neo-fascism. The other common feature is that within the monopoly groups, there is a specific new category of monopolists who really encourage, stand behind fascism. As a matter of fact, there's a book by Daniel Gérin called Fascism and Big Business, old book, 1938. Daniel Gérin, as you know, was an anarcho-Marxist, anarchist and Marxist. So Daniel Gérin's book discusses how, in the context of Germany, the old monopoly capital, which was, let us say, associated with things like textiles and the older industries, while of course they were supportive of fascism, they were not as close to the powers or to the fascist ruling as, in fact, a new element of monopoly capitalists who were in producers' goods, who were in armaments, who were in steel, and so on. And exactly you find the same phenomenon in Japan. There was the old Zaibatsu, but then there was a new group of monopoly houses called the Shinko Zaibatsu, which actually came up and which were the most ardent supporters of the military fascist regime in Japan. So within monopoly capital, there is a new group, particularly, which actually is very strong supporters of fascism. The last feature which I'd like to draw attention to is the fact that in fascism, you always have the cult of the leader. The leader is supposed to be a person who is representative of the fascist concept of a nation, and the fascist concept of a nation is something which actually stands above the people. The people are supposed to make sacrifices for the nation, and the nation is symbolized by the personality of the leader. I'd like to draw your attention to, in passing, between the concept of nation as we, for instance, understand it as a part of our anti-colonial struggle, and the concept of a nation that underlies fascism. Gandhiji, for instance, talked about the purpose of the nation being to wipe the tears from the eyes of every Indian. In other words, the nation was supposed to serve the people, while the fascist conception is that the people are supposed to serve the nation. It is not only the fascist conception, it is generally the imperialist conception. Most of you who have read Eric Maria Remarque's novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, you know exactly this is the kind of thing that imperialism inculcates, or the state power under imperialism inculcates among the students, among the youth, and so on and so forth. Now, these 6 features I've outlined are, of course, features which you find in classical fascism of the 1930s. Mussolini himself defined fascism as a fusion of corporate and state power. In other words, the corporates are not separate. The corporates are incorporated into the power structure. So the closeness of monopoly capital to the fascist state is something which was actually used by Mussolini as a defining feature of fascism. Similarly, as I said, the Balailas are a precursor of the kind of thing that you witness today occurring in many of these countries where neo-fascists are coming into power. The point is that authoritarianism is repressive. Fascism is not only repressive, it is repressive, but it represents a movement. In other words, it tries to represent a movement mobilizing people, mobilizing youth, of course, which is why it is not just like any authoritarian regime. Now, the fascist groups exist in any modern society, but usually as fringe elements. They come center stage only when they get the support of monopoly capital, monopoly houses, the financial support, and the media support as well, because a feature of monopoly capitalism is monopoly control over the media. Therefore, with the support of monopoly houses, you find the fascists, who are generally confined to the fringes, now coming center stage. And why does this happen? This happens precisely in a period of crisis of capitalism. Classical fascism had arisen in the 1930s during the Great Depression. Contemporary fascism or neo-fascism arises in a situation where I believe neoliberal capitalism has run into a dead end. It has run into a state of stagnation, where the rates of growth, for instance, in the world economy have come down very greatly. As a matter of fact, the period between 2012 and 2021, even if you don't take into account the impact of COVID, was really the slowest growth, decadal growth in the world economy in the entire post-war period. So that is slowest decadal. So the fact that the capitalist world economy is moving towards a state of stagnation is something which is the form that contemporary capitalist crisis takes. Why does it occur? I think it's quite important to see why there is this capitalist crisis. Neoliberal capitalism, I would say, for instance, after the war, there was this impression, because of the Keynesian revolution, because of the fact that social democracy had more or less adopted Keynesian measures to maintain very high levels of employment in the advanced capitalist countries. When I went to England, for instance, that Sohail was referring to, the level of unemployment in the British economy was only 2%. Similarly, around that time, the Kennedy years, for instance, the level of unemployment in the US economy was just 4%. So that in the entire history of capitalism, you had never had such high levels of employment, which is why that entire period is called the golden age of capitalism. Because if you have high level of employment and the trade unions are powerful, productivity is rising, the real wages rise because they have a bargaining strength to bid away some of the productivity gains for the workers, and therefore you had a period in which the working class did very well. The state intervention, at least in Europe, was state intervention in demand management that actually pushed up welfare expenditures and therefore pushed up the social wage. As a result, this was a period which is called the golden age of capitalism. But what is, therefore, the fact that you have today such a slowing down must come as a surprise, because we thought those were the years which were over. That from now on you really have a new kind of capitalism. As a matter of fact, when I was a student, there was a book called Has Capitalism Changed?, in which some of the best known economists of that period, John Kenneth Galbraith, Shigeto Suru, and Paul Sweezy, and so on, wrote, and the overwhelming impression or overwhelming opinion was that yes, capitalism has changed. As a matter of fact, now what you have is really some kind of a reversal to the older capitalism where the state intervention is limited. But before I come to why state intervention is limited, let me discuss why at all there is such a crisis in which the state is supposed to intervene but cannot intervene. The reason why there is a crisis is because when you look at the level of real wages, the level of real wages of workers, and in the context of societies like ours, we should say the working people, which would include workers, peasants, and so on, the level of per capita real income of the working people is something which has remained virtually stagnant, even though there has been a very substantial increase in labor productivity in all these countries, in the world economy, in the world capitalist economy. Why has the level of real wage or real incomes of the working people, why have they remained stagnant? As a matter of fact, Joseph Stiglitz has made a calculation according to which if you compare the real wage of an average male American worker in 2011 with the real wage of an average male American worker in 1968, you find that there is a slight fall in 2011 compared to 1968. And the reason is quite obvious, because of the fact that you have a situation where the workers can't demand high wages and can't go on strike demanding high wages, because if they do, then capital is going to relocate to Indonesia, to Bangladesh, to India, to other countries. Therefore, the very fact that capital is globalized while the trade union movement is still organized along national lines is something which actually weakens the trade union movement and therefore makes it impossible for the workers to raise their real wages, because now they are competing against the workers in the third world countries, and the workers in the third world countries, since they are located in the midst of huge labor reserves, have more or less a real wage rate that's close to a subsistence level. Therefore, the reason why real wages are not rising in the advanced countries, particularly in the US and also elsewhere, is pretty clear. But what about the reason why they are not rising in the third world countries, to which you have capital after all coming in? I think that is something which has to be carefully looked at. Basically, the neoliberal economy is one in which capital is globalized, including finance. But on the other hand, the governments, the states are nation states. Therefore, the jurisdiction of the nation state is confined to the ambit of the nation. On the other hand, capital is globalized, because of which no matter what your political views, even if you have the most left-wing government coming to power, if you remain confined within that ambit of globalization, if you have neoliberal policies whose crux is relatively free movement of goods and services and of capital, including finance, in that case, you more or less have to pursue policies which are exactly the policies demanded by this globalized capital. Because if you don't pursue those policies, they would leave your country. You would have an outflow of finance that would actually create a financial crisis in your country. Because of that, you look at Syriza, for instance, a very left-wing government that came to power in Greece, promising that they're going to change things. But on the other hand, when they had come to power, because they did not get out of this kind of vortex of globalized financial flows, they more or less pursued exactly the same policy because of which they were voted out. So, as long as you have the nation states confronting globalized finance, the nation state or the government of the nation state willy-nilly has to pursue policies which are to the liking of globalized finance. This is referred to in newspaper parlance as retaining the confidence of the investors. You must have come across this phrase, a very common phrase. Retaining the confidence of the investors basically means listening to the dictates of globalized finance. And no matter how left-wing you are, as long as you are structurally placed within that kind of a situation, you would be more or less willy-nilly forced to do that. Now, one of the implications of this is, of course, the withdrawal of the state from supporting peasant agriculture, supporting petty production, which the state used to do in the earlier epoch, in the pre-neoliberal epoch, in the epoch of dirigism. The state used to provide for, support peasant agriculture in several different ways. It gave subsidized inputs to agriculture. Banks were nationalized in order to provide such subsidized credit to the peasant borrowers. You had assured minimum support prices for every crop, food crop and cash crops. You had, let's say, the introduction of a whole lot of infrastructural investment which was undertaken which was supportive of peasant agriculture. And you had, of course, a certain amount of support in the form of medical and healthcare as well as education support, which peasant agriculture or peasants belonging to the agricultural sector took advantage of. Now, all these have disappeared. In India, the last thing which existed was, or which still exists, is government support to food grain producers by giving them a minimum support price, which the government wanted to withdraw, but on the other hand, it was not allowed to withdraw because of the year-long peasant agitation. That was the last thing that remains. But on the other hand, government support is withdrawn as far as cash crops are concerned, because of which you find that, cash crop prices fluctuate a great deal and cash crop requires credit, because of which you actually find almost 3 lakh peasants committing suicide, particularly in the cotton growing belt, because of this fluctuation of prices. What happens is, when the prices drop, then they have borrowed from banks in order to support, or they have borrowed from moneylenders in order to support their cash crop cultivation. They can't pay back the loans, and so they take their own lives. So, withdrawal of support from the cash crop producing peasantry, removal of subsidies on the various inputs provided, removal of the provision or cessation of the provision of subsidized credit, because of which now large numbers of peasants have to now go to a new class of money lenders. Just a few days ago, we had actually a meeting here in which there was a tribunal, before which various microfinancing institutions' loan policies were being discussed. These new kind of money lenders, among whom are the microfinancing institutions and so on, NBFCs, non-bank financial intermediate companies, they borrow from banks at subsidized rates, saying that they're going to give it to the peasants or give it to the women. But on the other hand, they themselves charge enormously high interest rates. So the idea of a new class of money lenders being intermediaries between the institutional banking system and of course the small peasant borrowers is something which gives rise to the peasants being exploited through high credit costs and so on. So, and then of course the privatization of healthcare as well as education is something which actually hits the peasantry very hard, because you don't have hospitals. The only place you can go to is, let's say, a private hospital where you pay through your nose in order to have your child or your parent or whatever admitted and taken care of. So for all these reasons, the state withdraws support from peasant agriculture and from petty production generally. Because the state withdraws support from peasant agriculture, the average income falls as far as the peasants are concerned, the average income. If the average income, because obviously input costs are going up, output prices are not going up as much. In fact, if you have time, I'll tell you a funny story. When I joined JNU in 1973, I joined as an associate professor. I was coming from Cambridge, and I joined as an associate professor. The basic salary of an associate professor then, basic I'm talking about, was about 700 rupees per month. Okay, the procurement price for wheat was about 70 rupees per quintal, so it was 1:10. Okay, now the basic salary of an associate professor in JNU, let us say, would be what, 1.5 lakhs per month, something of that kind, or even 1,20,000, while the procurement price of a quintal of wheat is about what, maximum 2,500. So 2,500 to, so 1:60. It was 1:10, 1:60 is now. So even when you have government price support continuing, which is true of food grains, in cash crops that's gone, even when the government price support continues, the prices have not increased to the same extent that they have increased in the rest of society. I mean, the incomes, prices meaning in this case, higher prices means higher incomes for the peasants. Incomes have not increased to the same extent as incomes in the rest of society, and therefore you actually find while costs are going up, incomes have not increased as much. Therefore there is a general decline as far as the peasants' conditions are concerned, because of which between 1991 census and 2011 census, which is the last one we have had, you have 15 million cultivators less. In other words, 15 million people. The census classifies the agricultural population into laborers and cultivators. You have 15 million less cultivators in 2011 compared to 1991. Obviously, some have become laborers, others have migrated to the cities in search of jobs. Therefore, you have, firstly, a swelling in the number of job seekers because of the crisis, because of the stagnation in the incomes of peasant agriculture and petty production. At the same time, because of the fact that now you have trade liberalization, There is greater competition between the different countries. Indian producers now have to compete against Chinese producers. They have to compete against Bangladesh producers and so on, because of which you now have a much faster rate of growth of faster rate of technological change. You have to introduce processes in order to cut your costs. You have to change products in order to cut your costs. You have to have malls instead of the old kind of, shops that you had, bazaars, markets and so on. So there is a change in the product mix, there's a change in the process mix, all of which gets accelerated because of freer flow of goods and services across country borders. Now that basically raises the rate of growth of labor productivity. Therefore, even though countries like India apparently have, though there's a doubt about it, have witnessed an increase in their growth rates, you find that the rate of growth of labor productivity has also increased quite dramatically. Now, the rate of growth of employment is simply the difference between the rate of growth of output and the rate of growth of labor productivity. If your rate of growth of output is 8%, but the rate of growth of labor productivity is 7%, that basically means that 1% is the rate of growth of employment. And therefore, there is a slowing down of the rate of growth of employment within the neoliberal regime compared to what prevailed earlier, which is very strange, because you have, if you look at the official statistics, approximately a doubling of the GDP growth rate on average, but you have apparently a halving of the rate of job creation. It was about 2% per annum earlier, now it's about 1% per annum. Now meaning in the neoliberal period as a whole, it's about 1% per annum. So precisely when you find that there is, and this rate of job creation is even less than the natural rate of growth of the workforce. In other words, if you have a 1% rate of growth of job creation, in that case, that is even less than the natural rate of growth of the workforce, let alone absorbing those who are moving from the countryside to the towns in search of employment. You can't even employ the natural increase in the workforce that actually occurs, because of which there is a rise in the proportion of the labor reserves in the labor force. And of course, therefore, if the proportion of labor reserves in labor force don't rise, then the wages don't rise. If the proportion of labor reserves in labor force does not fall, in that case there is no question of wages rising. Okay. If wages don't rise, you actually find that the per capita real income of the working population, because more of them are now unemployed, you actually find that would be falling. As a matter of fact, what you find, of course, in India in practice is not that there is a separate group of people who are fully employed and a separate group of people who are fully unemployed. What you have is that everybody who used to, you have casualization of labor, everybody who used to have, let's say, on average about 4 days of work earlier is now getting only 3 days of work. So employment rationing takes the form of each member of the workforce getting less work rather than some being fully employed and others being fully unemployed. So for all these reasons, the real wage rate doesn't go up, even the per capita real income of the working population actually falls. That is in the countries like India, which have grown more rapidly. Of course, if you don't even grow more rapidly, then the rate of job creation is even less. So in countries which have grown rapidly, which are supposed to be success stories of neoliberalism, you still find that the per capita real income of the working population is declining. In the advanced countries, as I told you on the basis of Stiglitz's figure, because capital is moving out, you actually find that the real wages are not rising. So taking the world as a whole, both the third world countries as well as the advanced countries, real wages don't rise. If real wages don't rise, but labor productivity is rising quite rapidly, that means the share of surplus rises. Of course, the propensity to consume out of the incomes of the working population is much greater than the propensity to consume out of the incomes that accrue in the form of surplus. Because of course, if you take a rupee from a working man, and you give it to a capitalist, in that case the capitalist is not going to consume the entire rupee immediately. He'll put part of it into his pocket and say, I'll spend it later on. Now the putting into the pocket is called saving, and therefore the propensity to save in any given period is much greater as far as the rich are concerned compared to the poor. Because of which you find that every such income shift from the poor to the rich, or from the working population to the surplus earners, is one that tends to slow down the rate of growth of consumption. If it slows down the rate of growth of consumption relative to the producible output, then the actual produced output itself does not grow as much, which is exactly what has happened in the world economy. For a while, consumption was held up because of asset price bubbles in the United States. There was a dot-com bubble in the 1990s. Then subsequently, when that collapsed, there was a housing bubble earlier this century. But after the collapse of the housing bubble, there has been no similar bubble of a similar magnitude, and because of which there is a general slowing down of the rate of growth of demand, because of which there is a general slowing down of the rate of growth of output, and therefore employment and so on. Now the question is, why is it that this is something which is not overcome through state intervention? Because that's what Keynes had told us would happen. Because of the fact that for state intervention to be effective in generating demand, state intervention in the form of greater state expenditure must be financed either by a fiscal deficit, or it must be financed by taxing the rich, who I said really save a larger proportion of their incomes. If the state spends, let's say 100 rupees, by raising taxes from the working population worth 100 rupees, the working population more or less spends all those 100 rupees on consumption anyway. So their consumption would go down by 100 rupees if it's taken in the form of taxes. And if the state spends those 100 rupees, there's no net increase in aggregate demand. So the net increase in aggregate demand arises only if government expenditure is financed either through a fiscal deficit or by taxing the rich, because if the rich save half of their income, then taxing them by 100 rupees would mean their consumption goes down by 50, their savings go down by 50, state expenditure rises by 100, so there's a net increase in demand of 50. Savings, by the way, don't constitute demand. All right, so precisely, but these two ways of financing government expenditure are both severely opposed by globalized finance capital. They are opposed by finance capital anyway, but when finance capital is globalized, its opposition is effective. If you tax the rich, then of course the financiers are among the richest. You would have an outflow of funds from your country, causing a financial crisis. Even if you have a larger fiscal deficit, that is something which would also give rise to similar fears in the minds of finance, and it will leave the country. I'll come to the question of fiscal deficit later on. But the proof of this was that, Liz Truss, who was the shortest serving Prime Minister of Britain, had to resign because Liz Truss's Chancellor of the Exchequer produced a budget in which he didn't actually produce a budget, he actually produced what he said was going to be the budgetary strategy, consisting of transfers to the capitalists financed by a fiscal deficit. Now so the fiscal deficit was not there for helping the people, it was there for helping the capitalists. But even so, because it was a fiscal deficit, financial outflows occurred from Britain, the pound sterling started falling on the foreign exchange markets, and Liz Truss had to resign. So the point is that finance's opposition to a fiscal deficit, larger fiscal deficit, is something that prevents this from happening, which is why almost all countries in the world now have fiscal responsibility legislation. Just imagine, we don't have a legislation that says that minimum 3% must be spent on health. We don't have a legislation that says minimum 6% must be spent on education, which is what the Kothari Commission had demanded. But we do have a legislation that says the fiscal deficit can't be more than 3%. In most countries, in India it is 3% for the center, 3% for the states. So the fact that this is enacted shows that governments have to kowtow to the caprices of globalized finance, and because that happens, you cannot really use a larger fiscal deficit. So the capacity of the state to intervene to raise the level of aggregate demand is something which is greatly undermined. Keynes, by the way, was aware of this. He actually wrote an article in 1933 in the Yale Review, in which he actually said that finance above all must be national, because he was aware of the fact that if finance is international and the government is of a nation state, then the government cannot intervene to raise employment, which is what he was suggesting. So, for these reasons, you have on the one hand a tendency towards a slowing down of the world economy, because it's happening everywhere. And this, by the way, underlies the inequality that you witness now growing all over the world, that people like Piketty have been writing about. So this underlies the slowing down of the world economy, and the governments can do nothing about the slowing down of the world economy. When this happens, then the hegemony of monopoly capital comes under question, because earlier it could always be argued that, okay, you're not benefiting from neoliberalism, just wait, your child is going to benefit. That basically, that it will trickle down. The benefit of neoliberal growth is going to trickle down, if not to you, to your children. But that is something which you can no longer claim, precisely because of the fact that the growth itself tends to slow down greatly. For these reasons, the hegemony of monopoly capital becomes threatened. Whenever the hegemony of monopoly capital gets threatened, monopoly capital makes an alliance with the neo-fascist elements, brings them center stage. For exactly this reason, you have a kind of monopoly fascist alliance, which in India takes the form of a corporate Hindutva alliance, and that really begins to rule. And that wards off the threat to the hegemony of monopoly capital, partly by changing the discourse. The discourse is now not about what's happening to your employment, not about what's happening to your real incomes, but about the fact that we have built a temple in Ayodhya. So that you change the discourse, you pick up a group, you pick up a minority group, and you generate hatred against it. You concentrate attention on the othering of that minority group, and that becomes the discourse. The other way that it also wards off the threat is now within the working population, you also now have a division, because obviously if it is the case that the Hindus and Muslims in the working population are really supposed to be hating one another, in that case you cannot have, the possibility of a united struggle gets to that extent weakened and undermined. Okay? And that is something which again wards off the possible threats to the hegemony of monopoly capital. Now, the there is an additional factor which I want to draw your attention to. So the rise of fascism is something which, the rise of fascism, the rise of fascist elements is of course to be expected in a period of crisis. Neoliberal capitalism has come to a kind of dead end where the state cannot intervene, where the crisis itself cannot be overcome within the boundaries of neoliberalism, and therefore the necessity arises for monopoly capital to change the discourse. It is said that the German philosopher, Walter Benjamin had actually said that fascism comes on the backs of a counter-revolution. He was talking about the German situation, where, of course, as you know, in 1918 there was an attempt at a workers' revolution, an attempt in which people like Rosa Luxemburg lost their lives. Again in the early 1920s there was an attempt at workers' revolution. These failed revolutions had left the working class greatly weakened, because of which the fascists could take power. That was his kind of reading. Now obviously we have had no such failed revolutions in recent times, but what we have had is in fact a weakening of the working class in the period of neoliberalism. This weakening arises for a number of reasons. The first reason is, of course, as I said, because now working class struggles are confined, or always, because trade unions are confined to the nation state while capital is globalized. So if it is the case that somewhere the workers go on strike, then capital simply shifts to some other country. Therefore, the strength of the working class gets undermined because of that. Secondly, as I mentioned, the reserve army of labor, the proportion of the reserve army of labor tends to rise, and that in turn also weakens the working class. The third factor, which is very significant as far as the weakening of the working class is concerned, is the privatization of public sector units. You see, everywhere in the world, public sector is one where the workers are much better organized, they are much more unionized than private sector units. In America, for instance, according to a figure I had seen, roughly 1/3 of the government employees, of the public sector, including education, of course, roughly 1/3 of the employees are unionized, while in the private sector the proportion is about 8% or so. So privatization of public sector units necessarily gives rise to a weakening of the working class. And this weakening of the working class plays the same kind of role that, for instance, you had Walter Benjamin thinking that had played in Germany. By the way, one of the reasons why in countries like France the trade union movement is still very strong is because France still has a substantial public sector presence. So within the corpus of neoliberalism, the seeds of neo-fascism are already there. They are there through the weakening of the working class. They are there through, for instance, another factor which I have not mentioned is that, that the urban middle class, from which the intelligentsia comes out generally, the urban middle class is much more integrated into neoliberalism. It's a beneficiary of neoliberalism. I gave the example of the salaries of JNU teachers or university teachers. University teachers are by no means a privileged group in the country. But even they are better off than farmers, which basically shows that the others, of course, other groups of urban middle class, particularly upper segments of the urban middle class, are doing very well, because of which, of course, they are much more integrated into neoliberalism. Therefore, their distance from the working population tends to increase. Because their distance increases, the distrust of the working population in the urban upper segments of the middle class tends to grow also. There was a time, for instance, that if you were a professor at JNU and you went out, people would really treat you with great respect. There have been innumerable occasions when I have broken traffic rules while driving, and the person and the policeman tells me, "क्या करते हैं?" I said, "JNU में पढ़ाते हैं." "अच्छा जी जाइए." But that kind of thing has changed. I'm not saying fully changed, but there is a certain change in it, which is why the leader of the Hindutva elements in the country can really use words like Tukde gang, Khan Market gang in order to debunk the intelligentsia, in order to debunk the thinking population. Now the thinking population precisely is the one that stands for secularism, that understands, as it were, the kind of nuances of the government's policies in various ways, etc. And therefore it's a way of cashing in on the distance which has grown between the working people on the one hand and of course the upper segments. Now all these are things which mature within neoliberalism. So the seeds of neo-fascism are there within neoliberalism, but they actually become, they come into the open and then they fructify in the period of crisis of neoliberalism. Now the point is that from what I am saying, it follows, certain conclusions follow. The first thing which follows is that fight against neo-fascism, by the way, I call it neo precisely because of the fact that unlike old fascism, neo-fascism is incapable of intervening in the economy to get rid of the recession, to get rid of the stagnation and so on. Old fascism had done it. Both Germany and Japan had run massive fiscal deficits in order to finance government spending on war effort, government spending on military expenditures, because in preparation for the war. The opposition which finance capital would have raised against this expenditure normally, which it must have raised, was taken care of by the following assurance. You see, why does finance capital oppose a fiscal deficit? Because if the government intervenes in the economy for providing employment through a larger fiscal deficit, then there is a general fear that, look, this government intervention basically means that tomorrow some other government would come and start nationalizing. So a fear of the next government going much more to the left is something which in fact frightens finance, and that's one of the reasons of the objection to the fiscal deficit, because there is no rational economic reason for an objection to a fiscal deficit other than the fact that the fiscal deficit increases wealth inequality. But that is not what frightens monopoly capital. But under fascism, there is no next government. So the fascists can actually reach a deal with finance capital which is national and say, don't worry, we are not going to do, in fact, if anything, we'll give you various kinds of benefits, and there is no next government. But in a normal functioning, if it is the case that there is a next government, there would be an opposition of finance capital to a larger fiscal deficit or to larger state intervention anyway. Now that opposition becomes decisive when finance capital is globalized while the state remains a nation state, because when that opposition is decisive, you have to listen to them. If you don't, they're going to quit your country. Okay. Therefore, for these reasons, I call it neo-fascism, because the kind of achieved, you see, there was a period, for instance, in Germany after 1933, when unemployment had been overcome. The horrors of the war had not yet visited Germany, but during that period, even the fascists had acquired a kind of popularity because they had overcome the Great Depression. Japan was the first country in the world to overcome the Great Depression through exactly this policy of running huge fiscal deficits to finance military expenditures. Now, that is not possible today because, as I said, the finance capital then was national, finance capital today is international. So the change in conjuncture has to be reckoned with, which is why I call it neo-fascism as opposed to classical fascism. If from this it follows that now we are in a situation in which you cannot overcome the crisis of neoliberalism within neoliberalism. Now, if you cannot overcome the crisis of neoliberalism within neoliberalism, then the conjuncture which produces neo-fascism would continue. Even if, for somehow, the neo-fascists lose elections, as Trump did, they'll come back. Because the succeeding government would not have overcome the crisis that actually produced fascism in the first place. Therefore, it follows that in order to overcome neo-fascism, we have to overcome the conjuncture that produces neo-fascism. To do that, we have to overcome, we have to not only have a political fight against neo-fascism, but also economically transcend neoliberalism. Now, the fact that something has to be done at the economic level is now widely recognized even by those who just the other day used to debunk transfers to the poor as handing over freebies. Okay, Modi had said that this transfers to the poor is pointless, just handing over freebies. But even they are forced now to provide some kind of succor to the distressed population, and that's a recognition of the distress. Because of this, however, we cannot stop at this, because this distress does not mean, this succor does not mean the end of distress. It is something which actually ameliorates distress, it's something which provides some help, but on the other hand, it doesn't overcome the distress. Secondly, this is something which actually is against the fundamental dignity of the recipient of this succor, because the impression is given that this is Modi ji's gift to you, so that you are simply people who are receivers of largesse which is handed out by somebody on top. It is offensive to the dignity of the people who are the recipients of this, who do not get it as citizens, but who get it as kind of, people who are like recipients of alms. And thirdly, these can be withdrawn at any time if the fiscal situation becomes bad. Just as, for instance, the NG and REGS is now being whittled down, the government can actually cut these at any time. So this is no way of providing succor to the distressed. I said that there has to be a transcending of the neoliberal order. The transcending of the neoliberal order must take the form of building a welfare state in the country. Building a welfare state, to my mind, would require, certainly in India, the introduction of a set of fundamental justiciable economic rights. Just as we have political rights, we have civil rights and so on, we have to have a set of economic rights. We made some calculations that if you introduce 5 fundamental economic rights, the right to food, in which I say that food should be made available to all, exactly on the terms in which it was made available to the BPL population before the pandemic. If you have a right to employment, which means that if you cannot provide a job to a person, then you have to pay the person a full wage. If you have a right to free, quality universal health care along the lines of a national health service. Likewise, you have free, quality, universal education, at least our calculations up to the higher secondary level, to everybody. And of course, you have living non-contributory pension to everybody who is of a pensionable age, and corresponding disability benefits. Then all these 5 rights together would cost about 10% of your GDP over and above what is being spent on these heads at the moment. Now, in order to spend 10% more, you don't need to raise taxes which are 10% of GDP more, because of the fact that a part of what you spend would come back to you automatically as taxes. To spend about 10% more, you need about 2/3% as taxes. Now, in order to do that, you can raise this amount just by 2 taxes levied on the top 1% of the population. One is a 2% wealth tax. The other is a 1/3 inheritance tax. That means whatever is bequeathed, 1/3 of it is taken over by the state. Now, I should say that these are extremely mild taxation proposals. As a matter of fact, in the US, both Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, who were actually contenders for the presidency against Joe Biden, had proposals for wealth taxation far greater, far more stringent than what I am suggesting. Likewise, when it comes to inheritance taxation, there is this view which the defenders of capitalism put forward, which says that, look, the capitalists get an income, they get a profit because they have some special quality. Okay, whatever that quality may be, let's accept that argument. But if you accept that argument, in that case, the children of the capitalists must show that same quality in order to be able to get a part of that income. But if not, in that case, they have to start afresh, and they have to exhibit that special quality. Which is why even advanced capitalist countries have very high rates of inheritance taxation in the form of death duties. In Japan, for instance, 55% is the death duty. In other words, if I die, if I leave my estate to my children, then 55% of it would be taken over by the state. In Britain and the United States, about 40% is the death duty. I'm suggesting only 1/3 as the inheritance taxation. I don't mean only death duty, because then people don't have to wait till the death. They would start parceling out their estate right during their lifetime. So these are proposals which are eminently doable, but the problem is that if you wish to put these proposals into effect, then immediately there would be an outflow of finance. If there's an outflow of finance, then you have to have capital controls. If you have capital controls, then inflow of finance would dry up, in which case you would not be able to pay for your trade deficit. Your imports are larger than your exports, and you meet it currently because of the inflow of finance. So if financial inflows stop, you cannot meet your trade deficit. So you have to have trade controls, you have to have controls on your imports. Therefore, you have to have trade controls and capital controls, and also an active state that meets all these guaranteed rights, all of which represent a reversal of the neoliberal regime. I think any move towards a welfare state today is a move that would have to be accompanied by a transcendence of the neoliberal regime. Okay? In other words, welfare state recognizes, whether wholly or partially, the sovereignty of the people. The neoliberal state institutes the sovereignty of international finance capital, and these two are not compatible. Therefore, the fight against fascism, we have to be very clear, is a fight which is much more comprehensive. It's not just the idea of getting rid of one government and having another government. It's a question of bringing about certain changes which would once more re-establish the dignity of citizenship, irrespective of what religion or what kind of ethnic group you belong to. Thank you very much.